Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called 10 perfect prog tracks line ranked, right? So what's my criteria for this? Well, I started to think, I thought, wouldn't it be good to, what if I was creating a compilation album of absolutely knockout prog tracks, what would I put on? And I started to come up with a list. I started to play with that because this is basically what this is a playlist, and I may well put the playlist up. So if you look down in the comments or the information for this video, you may see a playlist with all these tracks. And I started to put sort of my favourite tracks on, and then I thought, well, some tracks really represent what prog is. It's like if an alien came down and said, what's this progressive rock music? You go, well, have a list of this and then have a list of this. So that became a criteria as well, was songs that really defined what prog is. And then also I started to realise that prog is a very important form, and we don't champion the actual cultural impact that this form has had. And there's certain tracks that the general public know, and that's what they would know as being prog. And it's interesting sometimes to be able to point to those, especially the ones that are real masterpieces, and put those in the list. So that's what I've come up with. So we've got 10 tracks here, which I think are absolutely perfect. These are songs these songs have got no bad bits in whatsoever, that really represent the genre, and would form themselves into a really nice compilation album, which you could call, now that's what I call prog. And I might have a subtitle for this, which is that. So do you understand where we're at? Okay, so I know there's some really obscure Magma tunes or some can track that I haven't put on, or some Arion or some modern band I've never heard of that they've done something good and I should have included it. But it's not about that. This is about, culturally significant, monumental, perfect prog tracks. Okay? A bit like those two albums I got behind me now. Will anything off those albums be on this list? I don't know. Right? I think I'm gonna upset the proggers with this. But imagine you put the album out. And what we're gonna start off with, well, when I did the greatest prog albums and all that, I got criticised for not putting Frank Zappa on the list. And the reason is because I believe that Zappa is bigger than the genre. He does too much. You buy a Zappa album and, a third of it's prog, some of it's jazz fusion, some of it's comedy, some of it's blues, some of it's heavy metal, some of it's classical. And he does all sorts of things. And that thing in itself you could call as proggy. But I think for people who are prog fans, they could well, I've got this album and I've listened to the whole of side one, and there doesn't seem anything proggy on here. When Zappa does something proggy, he really does, and he so often in a form where one of the elements of it is extending popular rock music forms by using classical techniques. He is an absolute master of that. Some of the prog bands aren't actually that good. They're great rock bands, and they extend the form by basically writing lots of rock songs and put them together. When I used to play in the prog bands, we used to call that the prog sandwich. The prog sandwich is where you do something proggy at the start, then you go into a song, and then you do something proggy at the end, or something along those lines. But Zappa was a true composer, and I thought if I had this compilation album, the first track I would want to be a fanfare and go, this is progressive rock. It's like rock, but it's like classical music, and it would want to sound like a fanfare. And of course, Frank Zappa was brilliant at fanfares. So opening up this album at number 10, and remember I'm ranking these, so this album will get better and better as we go along as well. It's going to build up to an absolute, the greatest prog track of all time, hopefully, and then you'll all disagree with me, and I'll be there writing 300 comments answering why I didn't put something on. But here we go. So at number 10, right, opening up our album is from Frank Zappa. We have Egyptian Strut, which sounds like some Roman fanfare. You can imagine gladiators coming out to this. But it also has this faintly comic sound as well that's slightly absurd. Right? A fanfare that is slightly absurd. Isn't that what progressive rock is? So that's what I've got at number 10. Starting up my album is Egyptian Strut by Frank Zappa. That comes off, that was originally going to be on the album Leather, the box set. It then appeared on those trio of albums that I've discussed on another video. I think this one was on Studio Tan, wasn't it? And then he had Sleep Dirt and he had Orchestral Favourites. I've got this cropping up on so many different albums. I've actually forgotten which album. It's Studio Tan, isn't it? If I got it wrong, I've got it wrong. But it's one of my favourite Zappa compositions. It's not weighed down by just mathematical density. It's a beautiful melody, incredibly arranged. When you're listening to it, you feel that you're listening to a rock band, but also an orchestra. And it's neither of those. It's just Zappa's brilliant arrangements. That's my opener on my compilation album. That's what we call prog. That's what I got number 10, Egyptian Struts. Right. So number 9, right? So we've opened up our album. I want to hit them with something that's so proggy, from probably the most proggiest prog band of all the prog bands, which is of course Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant for me are prog's prog. You know, Gentle Giant are a difficult listen. And I thought, what track sort of embodies everything that Gentle Giant does, but is also accessible and hits you really in the face. And I thought, it's got to be the track that got me into Gentle Giant. I'd heard a few Gentle Giant tracks, and then one day I heard this track, and at that point I was hooked. There's heavier Gentle Giant tracks. I could have put Knots on, I could have put Proclamation on, I could have put something off Three Friends, which I think is probably their peak in terms of Gentle Giantness, you know, the complexity and the conceptual stuff. But the track that pulled me into Gentle Giant's world is the track Just the Same off the album Freehand. And that is so funky and accessible and so hooky, and yet it does all the weird stuff that Gentle Giant does, from the weird clapping in the sort of odd times and the way it lurches in, and then the sort of hocketing as the melody moves around the band, and it's got a subtle jazz fusion sound to it as well, which I really like. Gentle Giant are funky and groovy. You know, all the great prog bands were really funky and groovy. That's something that modern prog bands have forgotten. Unless you listen to my prog band Rain, we try and be very funky. But Yes and Crimson and Genesis, they had a groove to them. They've all got a groove, and Gentle Giant did as well. So that's why I've got number 9 is Just the Same, the second track on the album. Right, so what have I got at number 8? One of the things I love about prog is that what I call the English aesthetic. Right, this is why I think I favour English progressive rock bands. I think that's part of the sound. When I listen to bands like Can, Faust, or Magma, or Kansas, or Utopia, they're either trying to ape that English aestheticness, which I think you get with Kansas, and it's not quite there, or in the case of the European bands, it's a different, almost like a different style of music. That English aesthetic is very important, and it's embodied. Gentle Giant has it, Genesis have it, Yes have it, Crimson have it, especially on the earlier albums. The band that has it the most is Jethro Tull, and it's that aspect that I like about Jethro Tull. Of course, Jethro Tull started out as a blues band, but then when Ian Anderson gets control of the band, he then brings in this sort of almost like medieval folklore, acoustic sort of thing, but they still rock. The track where they just blow me away, and it's so complex. I thought, third track in now, people are listening to this compilation album, let's hit them with some progressive complexity. And that track for me is Songs from the Wood, from the album Songs from the Wood, which, as when I was a kid, the album was nowhere near my favourite Jethro Tull album. It was actually Stand Up, and it was tracks like, Nothing Is Easy and Fat Man and all that. I just loved that sound, which actually when you hear it is a little bit more accessible. By the time they got to Songs of Wood, Barrymore Barlow's joined the band. They're just sort of this virtuoso powerhouse, which was able to weave their way through this sort of weird rock take on medieval folk music. And Songs from the Wood has just got that in buckets. I absolutely love it. I go back to it regularly. I was listening to it just a week or so, and I'll go back to it again. So that's what I've got at number 8 is Songs of the Wood. Right. Number 9, I have The Great Gig in the Sky by Pink Floyd. Right. Why have I got that? Well, Pink Floyd are one of the biggest bands in the world, and they're a progressive rock band. I don't care what you say. What do you else? There's so many people. They're not a prog band. There's a band that makes conceptual albums with odd time signatures, huge amount of experimentation. With vast long tracks that employ classical, motifs like with Atom Heart Mother, avant-garde concepts. How is this not a prog band? What are you on? The people who are saying that, they don't sound like Genesis. I'm sure there's a contingent of prog fans that their definition of prog is stuff that sounds like Yes and Genesis. Right, not Pink Floyd. Why not just change your worldview and say prog is Pink Floyd? What else are they? They're like a classic rock band, a folk band. What are they? They're prog. God, why am I even arguing with them? Pink Floyd are prog, okay? And at their most proggiest, they are unbelievably prog. Echoes, Atom Heart Mother, incredibly prog. Dark Side of the Moon has such a huge cultural impact on music. This is an album that came out and went into the charts for about 40 years or whatever. There's all these, myths about it, that if you get stoned and put on, The Wizard of Oz, it has all these secret meanings, which is something that was being completely debunked now by Roger Waters recently. I think as time goes on and the 70s happens, punk happens, and they start to draw themselves in, I think that they do change, and... Is The Wall a prog album? I think it is. I'm not a massive fan of The Wall. And I think they do lose their way, actually. But I think that run of Dark Side of the Moon, Animals, and Wish You Were Here is a tour de force for prog. So why Great Gig in the Sky? I can remember as a kid seeing that tune on adverts. There was an adverts for a headache tablets, and it started off with all the screaming, and then that bit when it just calms down as they took the tablet. This track has had huge cultural significance. Now, does it deserve going on the list just because of that? Well, no. It's also an incredible track. It's incredible in that it is utterly progressive. It's almost classical in its structure, but it's also so close to soul. And soul, I think, is, like I said, groove and soul and funk is so important to the great progressive rock bands. The other day I was driving along with my kids in the car, and the radio's on, and they're playing all the usual rubbish. They have played Beyonce and Kanye West and something, and whatever. And then, for some reason, they put on The Great Gig in the Sky. And the whole mood in the car changes, and my kid's like, Dad, what is this? This is unbelievable. What is this? I go, it's Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Us prog fans will forget this, but for so many people, Dark Side of the Moon is as far out as they go. Right, a friend of mine is selling their vinyl albums, and I looked through, and he got a lot of really great 80s albums. He got some Erasure albums, Depeche Mode, and he got Dark Side of the Moon. So many people have that album. And I think the great moment is Great Gig in the Sky. So that's what I've got as my 4th track on the album. All right. Okay, so the next one, again, is another track which I think has really crept into mainstream culture. And I think, if you went to a person in the street and played them this tracks, they would know this track. And that's Fanfare for Common Man by ELP. ELP, I've changed my opinion on as I've been doing this channel. As a kid, I loved them, and then I fell out with them, and I thought they were overblown, over the top. They didn't really know what they were doing. They made some terrible albums in the 80s, and Love Beach is rubbish, and I don't know. And they've had all these stupid comedy tracks and these Mrs. Mills moments on piano on the albums. And it wasn't heavy like the Mavish Nutshire, it wasn't King Crimson, and I sort of went off them. And then doing this channel, having so many people, going, what about ELP? And I've sort of, when I did my top 20 prog bands, I forgot about ELP. I'd taken, and I felt so bad. And I went back and listened to Tarkus, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. And then I thought Keith Emerson was there doing this right from day one. They're really important, and Keith Emerson's compositions are great. And I think, when they're at their best, they are one of the greatest progressive rock bands, and I've changed my tune about it. They do go off a little bit though, don't they? You know, after brain salad surgery, it's a bit of a downhill slide, isn't it, for ELP? And those Works albums, Pirates is good. There's some good stuff on there. But there's this hit single, Fanfare for Common Man. Now, what do I think about that? I think it's absolutely amazing. It's just brilliant. Is it doing what ELP does? Yeah, it does what ELP does. And the thing that ELP does that none of the other progressive rock bands do is take actual classical pieces of music, whether it's hoedown or pictures at an exhibition, and reworks them into a rock band style, which kicks and rocks, right? They do that brilliantly. You know, Andrew Lloyd Webber did it with Variations. He did it with that. You know, people have done it. You know, you had your disco versions of Thus Spake Zarathustra. This has happened. But ELP are great at it because they have a signature sound and they rock when they do it. By far the most successful thing they ever did in the adaptation of classical music to rock music is Fanfare for Common Man. And when I listen to that, that's an instrumental track, right? Because I like them at their best when Greg Lake's not singing. Not all the time. But it's an instrumental track. It rocks. It does everything you want prog to do, right? It doesn't, it's not a prog band pulling themselves in to get a hit record. It's out and out prog, and there it sits, you know, representing the genre so well. And I think if there was a track on here, they were going to say, you know what progressive rock is, and you played that, that is a brilliant, fanfare for progressive rock. That's what we've got at number 6 is Fanfare for Common Man. What have I got at number 5? At number 5, I have Tom Sawyer by Rush. Rush, for me, everyone on this channel, I love Rush, and my favourite album is Moving Pictures. Every track on there is a masterpiece. You know, people have argued to me that that's not progressive rock. Tom Sawyer is progressive rock. Think of the literary illusions of the lyrics. Right, think of taking the idea of a pop song and what that's about and expanding on it. Think of the idea of using classical motifs, of being able to expand the music with virtuosity, with odd time signatures, the use of the rock band and the use of that rock band interfacing with technology, which in this case is the recording studio. All that stuff is on Tom Sawyer, and they deliver it in a pop song. Right, a lot of these tracks here have been hit records, right? And I think that's more than apt. The tracks I've talked about so far, perfect, they are perfect. All of these tracks for me are absolutely perfect. But Tom Sawyer is the example of perfection. This is the sort of track that drives modern prog musicians to get in on Pro Tools and fix absolutely everything so it sounds perfect. But Rush didn't do it like that. Rush did it by getting in the studio and playing the stuff in the room together and getting a take where they didn't make any mistake whatsoever. Every fill in Tom Sawyer that Rush, and there's some incredible drum fills. I mean, how many tracks, that you could think of are hit records that feature a drum solo in the middle, and every one of those drum licks is absolutely perfect, and every drummer in the world knows them, right? This is iconic stuff, right? On this album, Moving Pictures, Rush come in and really lay the groundwork for any band that's going to come in after them to make progressive rock. I think if they hadn't made this album, there might have been no way through for progressive rock musicians. But what Rush do there is sell millions of albums with an incredible progressive. Come on, people! All right, stop being so snotty and elitist. Right? Those of you who sit there turning your nose up at this album and go, well, I prefer, Farewell to Kings and Hemisphere because it's just so much more proggy and that's the album I know. Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you got that opinion. That's really good. I'm glad you think like that. Great. But think about the perfection of this album and think what it represents. This is the greatest progressive rock album from the 1980s. It's one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. It's out and out prog, and everybody knows that. Tune, Tom Sawyer. Right. I can remember watching Futurama. You go and check it out. and you'll see a moment in that where I can remember watching it, and the aliens come and land, and as they start shooting the aliens, it sort of turns into Space Invaders, and Tom Sawyer starts up. You can actually go on YouTube and see all the cultural references where this track has appeared in all sorts of different mainstream media, you know, entities. This is an important thing. I've got to have it on the list. It has to be Tom Sawyer. That's the one for me. Number 5. Right. Number 4. We now got to go deeper, right? And I thought we've got to have Genesis on this list. What's Genesis' greatest prog moment? For me, it's Supper's Ready. On this channel, I keep changing my mind on what the greatest Genesis album is, and I think what it is because Genesis have all these different factors and facets, and they've done so well, you know. So, what's their best live album? You just pick something, you know, like that. Well, you've got Seconds Out, of course, but I love Three Sides Live, and the version of In the Cage on Three Sides Live is just one of the greatest prog moments of all time. But anyone who's got the box set, the archive, there's a live version of Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and I think it's better than the album, you know. So there we go. There's 3 incredible live recordings, live albums from Genesis. What's their greatest prog moment? Well, I think it's arguable that their greatest prog moment is Trick of the Tail. That's when they're at the peak of their powers. It just hasn't got Gable, so it doesn't have that stamp on it. But in terms of production and composition, Trick of the Tail is incredible. If you want to look at the sort of pop success they had and marry that with the prog thing, then is The Duke the greatest album? Right, but if we go to the classic albums, which would be trespassed to some extent, but I don't think it quite cuts it, but Nursery Crime, which I've got behind me, Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound, and Lamb Lies Down, that quartet of incredible prog albums. Which one's the best one out of those? If you just want to just say which is the best of those proggy Gabriel albums, which one is it? Which one is it? You know, and I think it goes like this. Nursery Crime has the greatest Genesis prog vibe about it. Whatever Genesis gives you as a sort of gut feeling, Nursery Crime's got that in the most. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is an incredible conception. It's like their Tales of Topic Ocean. I'm getting my words tied up. It's like their Tales of Topographic Oceans. It's their great conceptual moment with some of their greatest moments on record, but also it's a bit meandery, you know. I think most people would say that. Supper's Ready is probably the most perfect of the 3 in terms of production and writing. And Foxtrot has on side 2 Supper's Ready, which is just their best moment. Right? And they have some classic master, you know, real brilliant tracks on side 1 as well, Watch of the Skies and all that stuff. And I think they're classic Genesis tunes. But I feel that the side 1 is just weaker than side 2, than Supper's Ready, and that's obvious because Supper's Ready is an absolute masterpiece. Supper's Ready, in terms of their prog thing, when you step back, I still think is their absolute peak. It's quirky, it's funny, it's epic, it's and it gives Genesis always gives me a feeling, and it's sort of the same feeling that you get from sort of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, Edwardian English ghost story, science fiction, but in a hammer horror Quatermass way. It's an English gothic aesthetic, but shot through a sort of slightly Monty Python worldview. That's how I've described it, and they just do that on Supper's Ready, and it's an absolute, you know, peak of that. So that's what I've got on my album at number 4. That's going to be the 4th one. So I've got 3 tracks that are better than Supper's Ready. So what could they be? Right, here's going to be a contentious choice. At number 3, I have Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. Right. Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen has become one of the greatest tracks on earth. It's like Mr. Blue Skies by ELO. It's like Let It Be by the Beatles, and Stairway to Heaven. And in fact, it's got more cultural grip than Stairway to Heaven. You could play Bohemian Rhapsody to children and they would get it and they would love it. I once did a show with my students at the college I teach at, and we wanted something just to... We did this big gig and I wanted something just to finish off the audience, you know, to absolutely blow them away. And it was like, well, why don't we do Bohemian Rhapsody? And at the moment that piano started up on that track, on that gig, the whole audience just hushed. Oh my God, they're going to play Bohemian Rhapsody. And why would they do that? Because this is out and out prog. Think about it. This Bohemian Rhapsody is out and out prog. A Queen of prog band, yeah, they got progressive tendencies without a doubt, and they go there. But Bohemian Rhapsody is as prog, if not more prog, than anything we can think of. Right? It does everything that prog should do. I don't have to spell this out to you, do I? It just does. Right? It's a huge achievement. And the fact that they pull that off and then it becomes such a huge track, right? Any bit of it you could sing to someone and it's like a hook. Any bit of it. Nothing really matters. It's incredible. Any bit of it. You could sing, you could play the opening riff, you could play the guitar solo that Brian May plays. You can go, I see a little silhouette of a man. You could do that any bit, however bonkers it gets. And this track is absolutely bonkers. And I think in terms of progressive rock, this is probably prog's greatest, what would the word be? Greatest calling card, you know, to the world. So that's what I've got at number 3, is Bohemian Rhapsody. So what's at number 2? We got to the... and all these I'm saying are perfect. Every single track on this list I think is perfect. I think Bohemian Rhapsody is absolutely perfection. It's a work of utter genius. Really is. And you prog fans should be proud that the genre you like is capable of producing the most obscure, weird stuff. Is capable of... showcasing such incredible talent with such individuality, but is also able to produce such huge songs like Tom Sawyer, like Fanfare for Common Man, and like Bohemian Rhapsody that will live on in our culture forever. Because if we didn't have those tracks doing that, this genre would have died, right? And this genre that we love so much pretty much is birthed at a particular moment in music history, right? There's all sorts of stuff flying around. There's like the Moody Blues, the Beatles have done stuff, the Knives with Keith Emerson are exploring certain areas. But then King Crimson come out with In the Court of the Crimson King. And I've argued on this channel that album is an incredible album that is really, you know, that you can point to it and go, that's where prog begins. But it's slightly uneven. It's a masterpiece, but there's certain things for me on that album where I go, oh, this is going on for too long, and this is a bit dull, and this bit is just, you know, why did they do this? There's moments like that. But the opening track of that album, 21st Century Schizoid Man, just does everything that prog is ever going to do ever again. Absolutely everything. It's bombastic, it's complex, it's got weird subject matter, studio experimentation, jazz improvisation, extremely complex passages, huge, you know, tumultuous orchestral sections. They nailed it on that track. 21st Century Schizoid Man. God, what a track. And I think the whole reputation of In the Court of the Crimson King is on that track. Everything after that was a bonus. But for people at the time who bought that album and took it home, and you know, and they had the Herman and the Hermits albums and maybe a few Hendrix albums and stuff like that, and they put that on, it must have just been the most terrifying experience. It must have seemed inhuman that, you know, that they'd done this. It's absolutely astonishing. I think that 21st Century Schizoid Man is not only the defining track of progressive rock from which all of the progressive rock is going to then have to salute. It also heralds jazz fusion, because there's an incredible like free jazz exploration section in there, and it also heralds heavy metal. You know, it's 69, we've got Black Sabbath with their sort of blues rock, which has been pushed with that sort of satanic imagery, but 21st century Schizoman is as heavy as Sabbath, but you got that distorted vocal, and you know the whole message of this track. You know, it's all there. So I think, you know, not only do we have prog there, but we have the beginnings of heavy metal and jazz fusion. This is a hell of a track. This is why prog is so great. The other day I was chatting to my students, I thought I mentioned this on another video, and they didn't really know what progressive rock was. And I had one shot, I could play them a track. I could have played them Fanfare for Common Man, Tom Sawyer. But I decided to play them 21st Century Schizoid Band, and we sat through the whole thing. And they were shocked. You know, whatever thrash metal they're listening to, or pop punk, or, you know, drum and bass, whatever it is, nothing's as heavy as this track. So that's what I got at number 2. So what do I have at number 1? Okay, in doing this channel and thinking all these lists up, I have come to the conclusion that there is a track which is the greatest progressive rock track of all time. Right? And I don't want to put up, it can't be some 3-minute track that just nails prog in 3 or 4 minutes like Tom Sawyer. It can't be that. It can't be some popular hit record, because that's not what prog is. This number 1 has to do everything that prog does. It has to do the whole lot. It's got to be huge, epic. It's got to take you from one place and land you in another place and take you on a journey into outer space. This track at number 1 here has to be the greatest, perfect prog track of all time. And this here, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think I've nailed it. I think I know this is the greatest prog track of all time. So at number 1, the most perfect progressive rock track of all time, I think, is Awaken by Yes off the Going for the One album, which I think was made in 1977, but I might be wrong, 76, somewhere around that time. So I'm giving you a bit of space to think about it. What do you think? What do you think? I've got to number 1. What do you think? That's my number 1. What do you think? Some of you will be going, yes, Andy's right. Totally right. It is. It's unbelievable. Another one's like, oh, why is he wrong with him? And they're throwing things at their little phone screen and getting all irate. Oh, how can you say that? That's not even Yes's best album. Close to the Edge is their best album. That's way better than Awaken, which is why I put it up in the background, because I knew people would say that. And I think that there is nothing on Close to the Edge which is anywhere near what they do on Awaken. Yes, for me, are the progressive rock band. I think I think they just define what it is, and that's personal to me, because they're the band that got me into this genre. You know, I swapped a Hawking picture disc for the Yes album with this guy at school, and he'd swapped it with me because he bought it and he said it was unlistenable and he hated it, and he knew I was into weird stuff, and he said, you know, we got into the swap, and the fact I had a picture disc, I think, did it. I took the Yes album home, and what was on there, that's what I was looking for when I was listening to all those, you know, Diamond Head and Iron Maiden albums and Led Zeppelin. That's what I was looking for. And what was it? It was the way that you take like rock music and then you expand it out lengthwise, breadthwise, technology-wise, playing-wise. I wanted to hear something else. I didn't want to hear blues guitar solos. I didn't want to hear verse, chorus. You know, I didn't want to hear the same rock beat all the way through. I wanted to be taken off on something. I wanted my ears to have something to latch onto and just enjoy. And I feel Yes do that so well. And I think it comes from the fact that, yes, John Anderson is brilliant at writing short, fragmentary lyrics. He I think later on he learned how to write songs, and I've said this elsewhere on the channel, but I think when Steve Howe and then Rick Wakeman came in, they discovered a way that they could take these incredible vocal fragments and rephrase them in different contexts, and this becomes a thing unique to Yes, and they start to explore it. On Close to the Edge, they nail it, but it's a fight, right? And I could go through that album, point out where I can hear that it's a fight. By the time they get to Going for the One, right, and they've gone all through that thing, and they've done Topographic Oceans, and then Rick's left, and Patrick Moraz has come in, who's an absolute virtuoso, and they've really pushed the boat out with Relaya, which is an incredible album. And then they all reconvene, and I think there's a conciseness to this album. I think they're drawing themselves in on this album, but they're doing it in the right way. They're just pulling everything down. Now, Awaken is a 15-minute epic. Now, when I did my top 10 epics, even though Awaken was my favourite track, I didn't put it on. And I'll tell you why, because I made a mistake. Because I didn't think it was 15 minutes long. I thought it was about 7 minutes long. And my rule was it had to be over 10 minutes. And then when I realised it, you can see I put notes on in the comments saying it should have been Awaken, that should have been number one. And the reason is because that 15 minutes flies by. It takes you on a journey. I'm going to do a video at some point on the Friday Rock Show, which was a radio show in the UK, which was very important to me, and I think it was very important to a lot of other people of my age. And I'm going to have a look at the theme musics that was on there, because there's incredible music. I think all us metal fans, new wave of British heavy metal fans, would put the Friday Rock Show on, and Tommy Vance, the great Tommy Vance, would introduce us to new music. Now, I was reading up about them, about the show, and once a year they would have the top 10 greatest tracks of all time, and on there was Awaken twice, and I heard it. And when I looked down the list, there was like 2112, no, Xanadu by Rush, there was Stairway to Heaven, all the stuff that I basically went on to buy and is set behind me now, which took me on a journey, I think is from those top 10s that Tommy Vance used to put together. I think I heard Awaken then, and I think it had I remember hearing it, not Stairway to Heaven, not Xanadu or 2112 or whatever, it was Awaken. This really for me is the peak of progressive rock. That's what I think. That's at my number one. So we're done. So that would be my that's what I call prog. That's what I call prog. Okay. I think I may have veered a little bit towards commerciality from the prog snobs. Let's see, but of course, if you do put some comments up, I will comment back and we can have a nice discussion. So be prepared for that. But it's all in fun. I think a lot of the viewers of my channel know that a lot of the time my tongue is firmly in my cheek. So with that, I will finish this video and go and do the next one. I'm going to do another one now. I'm on a roll today. So I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. And if you want to support me, I've got a Patreon. The link's down below. That would be great if you did.